Welcome everybody to the next episode of Roko's Basilisk. First of all, to set it up for our guests, our special guest tonight, Conor McDonough Quinn, Dr. Quinn, a linguist extraordinaire. Roko's Basilisk, this podcast started based on a scary thought experiment, perhaps the most scary thought experiment in all of AI. In fact, the people who started this conversation years ago had to delete it, but somehow when you try to delete things from the web, they don't stay deleted. Here's the idea. Someday, what if we do get an AI that decides, that it starts to control our lives? Control who goes to college, when you get a green light, what happens to your car on the highway. It's not super far-fetched. And what if this AI has a bad personality, let's say malevolent? And let's say this AI wants to reward those who helped it come into being, who supported it through the years, like its mothers and fathers, But it also wanted to punish those who didn't want that future AI. It can find out what you really think by reading all your past emails, texts, social media posts, everything. And then it can punish you. So we can kind of live in fear right now, kind of retroactive pain from future punishment we're going to receive someday. But there's even a worse possibility. Balak, would you?
I mean, it's pretty much too late for you and me and Connor and anyone who's listening in on this, right? We unfortunately didn't give them a warning, but now that you have this knowledge, you are implicated like an accomplice. So if there's this maleficent AI in the future, you're doomed as well as we.
Welcome. Today's show is sponsored by SpaceX.
Really? We managed to get SpaceX as a sponsor?
Oh yeah, they're sponsoring us at a rate of $0, but they're sponsoring us.
Fantastic.
All right. So Conor is, as I said, a linguist extraordinaire. Me and him have had so many hours of conversations about languages. And I'd like to start off with a fun story. Talk about how you figured out there was a Basque word that was inherited in one of the Native American languages.
Oh, I didn't figure that out. It was sort of pointed at there. Baker or Baker. I've never heard how he says his own name. Baker. Oh, what's his first name? Anyway, if you look for the Baker or Baker reference, is a linguist who's worked mostly with the Mi'kmaq language and wrote a couple papers on contact between Basque language and Mi'kmaq language from early, that's documented in some early colonial accounts. And most of the Basque words that have come into Mi'kmaq, it's, some of them are sort of shared with Romance languages, so it's not as easy to tell were they Basque, were they French. One or two are sort of pretty clearly Basque, but not as obviously, like the Basque word errege, which means king, comes out as elegewid in Mi'kmaq, elegewid.
Where's Mi'kmaq spoken?
In the northeast of here. So
he's in Maine, by the way.
Mostly Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, the Maritimes area, and then inland from there. So that Basque word kind of stands out. And there's a couple other words. The word for Sunday and also the week look fairly Basque. But the one that really jumps out is the word, actually in Mi'kmaq Adlai, it's not quite as obvious, but as you go eastward from Mi'kmaq, coming into what's currently Maine, you get Atohau in Passamaquoddy and Atohowe in Penobscot. And in the Kennebec Valley, you got something that appears to have been written Antorehonwe. All of these clearly the same word, just as they've come out in these various different languages. And no other languages related to them have this word. It's just like this word exists in this exact region. And a word that long in these languages very typically is a compound of at least two elements that you'll find elsewhere in the language. But there is nothing that anybody's ever been able to find that remotely resembles Atohawe or adlai at all. So it just doesn't look like it was built out of anything from the language itself. And the Basque word for shirt is atorra. And so we're still trying to figure out what's going on with how you went from atorra and then added something else, atorrejonwe, atolhawe, that hawe element, hawe element. That may be something from the language itself, or kind of a little bit of a transition point between the Basque word and something that is added to it to fit it into the language. But the root itself as atorra from Basque seems to be the best possible explanation for the origin of this word for shirt, complemented by the fact that this word for shirt is only in the exact region where it sort of radiates out from where it's well known that the Basques and the coastal peoples, both the Mi'kmaq and probably people to the south of them as well, met up with each other. The thing that sort of stands out among the Basques of the day is that they came over and fished for cod and apparently traded shirts, European style shirts with indigenous people here, but they didn't colonize. They just went home back to Europe.
That was the Basque way.
Yeah, and you can even sort of tell that like what was in most of these languages, the word for cloth, like European style woven cotton cloth, is actually a derivative of the word for shirt. So it's like shirt material. So needless to say, in those days, European shirts and European cloth shirts were probably a pretty distinctive, valuable thing to trade with the Basques for, and so forth. And you can even still see that sort of percolating through the modern language, in that the word for woven cotton, etc. style cloth is derived from the word for shirt, not like the other way around or something.
That's fascinating. I had no idea. That's really, I can see why that's your favorite story there, Graham.
Mm-hmm. And I also love the Basque people.
Yeah, many reasons to do that.
Most definitely. It's a good example. Yeah, go ahead.
Another interesting thing about Native American languages that I'd love to hear from you more about, Conor, is when they study little kids, they find we have a shape bias. When you look at the different features of a thing that you could talk about, like there's this one little example, I think it's called, they call it the dax, I think. And it's just like a drawing of something that's vaguely like round shaped, but kind of a unique shape. And maybe it's blue and it's solid. And they say, one of these over here is also a dax. And one of them has the same shape, but a different color. The other one has the same color, but a different shape. And very, very consistently, kids will say, well, this is also a dax, as long as they're old enough to talk at all. But we have this bias that things of this, that if we have to decide which feature is the most important, shape is the one that we choose. And this is useful to a baby, because if you have a baby and they have a baby bottle that's blue and another one that's pink, the one that's pink will probably work just as well.
And is that from a, because you seem to imply, Graham, that it's some sort of sensory driven development, while I don't know, like I'm guessing that if you adhere to more the universal grammar of Chomsky, you would say it's much more innate than that whatever syntactic development there is afterwards is actually coming from this more innate universal grammar that's prototypical or something. But I mean, again, Conor is the expert here, so I'd love to hear his thoughts.
What I think I want to hear from Conor about is how this might interact with the fact that in Native American languages, in order to properly decline nouns, sometimes you have to know if it's shaped like flat or rod shaped or granular, something like that, right, Conor?
Yeah, it's not declining nouns like the way you do, and that says it's typically the item you're talking about, the thing you're talking about. It's actually about the verbs, and the verbs will generally be a different verb or a different addition to the basic verb according to the shape of the object involved in the action of the verb. And involved can be kind of in the action of the verb can be a lot of different things, but it's always some kind of involvement in the action of the verb. And there are two things that I think are particularly interesting about this. One is that it's all over North America across a whole bunch of different language families. It's probably most famous in the Dinebizad, also known as Navajo, and basically, to the best of my knowledge, most of its relatives, which is a vast family, usually called the Athabascan family, which has like the Apache language, and then tons of language, Hupa language also in California, and then a bunch of languages mostly up in Alaska and the sort of northern Pacific coast area, all through there. They all seem to, almost all of them that I've ever heard of, basically the verb to like grab and handle, manipulate, pick it up, move it, do things with it verb, there just isn't one of them. There's one for basically each of these kinds of shapes. So there's actually one for grab, handle, manipulate, position a stick-like object. And that's a completely different word from grab, handle, position a cord-like object. And then another one for a sheet-like object. And another one, as Graham was laying out, another one for manipulating basically granular material like flour or sugar or gravel and so forth. And then another one for manipulating liquids. And let's see, stick, sheet. Also it's just sort of a solid round object. And then I think in most of those languages, there's also one for manipulating something that's a living thing, like an animate creature, like a baby or a cat or something like that. And there's a couple more. It varies how many different kinds of these there are. But some of the real central ones are manipulating a stick-like object, manipulating a cord-like object, which could be rope, string, thread, hair, manipulating a sort of round blob, round lump like a rock-like object, and manipulating a sheet-like object. Those are the main like solids. And then again, there's often granular material like sand and so forth. Then there's also like lumpy, sticky material like clay, flour, that kind of stuff. Not flour, sorry, clay and dough, that kind of stuff. And then also finally liquid, manipulating liquids. And those, what's interesting about those particular categories is you get those over on that side of the, close to you guys' side of the continent, in those languages as just completely different words for pick up, position, manipulate, that kind of object. Meanwhile, over on this side of the continent, you don't get special verbs for each of those, but you do get exactly special elements, meaning almost exactly those things. So, for example, in Passamaquoddy, you have chkuya means coming this way, like he or she is coming this way. Chkuadigia means coming this way as a cord-like object. So chkuya would just describe anybody coming this way, but chkuadigia would describe like a snake wriggling its way towards us. So it brings in, you can literally, I have a friend who's a Passamaquoddy speaker, says, when you say it these ways, like with the shape elements, you can literally kind of see it, right? So chkuya coming this way, but chkuadigia coming this way in a cord-like fashion, as a cord, which could describe a snake wriggling this way, or a rope or a line that's in the water and it's kind of wiggling towards us, and so forth. If you say the element akwi means like a stick-like object. So, remember in the Penobscot story, they said Nasakwamana Wutub is like sticking a head on top of a stick and so forth. So there's a stick-like object involved in that. And then
How often do you think they use that phrase?
Stick
a head on the stick.
There's old stories of conflicts and so forth with different groups. And then jug is for like sticky objects. So like in Passamaquoddy, elmi means stretching away, stretching onwards, and elmijigek means the what do you call them? The clay flats, the clam flats, which are just like a bunch of clayey gunk stretching away into the distance. And those all have a jug, which means like the sticky matter and so forth. And then egg means like a sheet-like object. So Chidnegizawa, is ironing. Ironing sheets flat. They're chidnegizawa. Some people say chiganegizawa, but the egg element means that there's a sheet-like object involved. There's a elegiac would mean like how something is flapping in the wind. Eliac would just mean not flapping in the wind, but like Eliac would just mean how something's moving. But elegiac would mean how something's moving, and it's like a flag or a piece of cloth flapping and moving like this. And then you have something like Madalumpsen means the wind moves it. If you said Madpegalumpsen, that involves a liquid. So Madpegalumpsen would mean like the wind is moving the water, like the wind is causing.
Why don't European languages have this shape bias?
Well, so one of the things that's really interesting about these particular shapes is like, okay, so if it's all across North America, you could say, well, these languages are all next to each other. Lots of people speak, more multiple languages. So this kind of feature, it's understandable that it's shared across peoples who are all related to each other, either by being neighbors or of the same origin. However, if you look in Mandarin Chinese, you'll see almost exactly the same categories, not as part of the action, as part of the verb, but what you need to do in order to count things. So stick-like objects are zhi, and if you want to say like yi zhi is one stick-like object. So if you're going to count pens or sticks, you're going to pens, you're going to say yi zhi pen, and so for yi zhi bi. And then cord-like objects are tiao. Interestingly, dogs are usually considered cord-like objects, so you say yi tiao go for a dog, but tiao would be what you use for rope and strings and so forth. So that you've got your stick-like object and your cord-like object. Yi ge is basically kind of any kind of thing, lump. And then yi zhang is a sheet-like object, like a sheet of paper. So Mandarin, especially the most commonly used counters, basically happen to have almost exactly the same shape categories as the major shape categories used in a lot of North American area languages, actually more than North American. And you'll even see fairly similar categories. They're a little bit different, but they're kind of more similar than not most of the time, in languages like Swahili and Zulu and Xhosa, where all of the nouns come with a little prefix saying what class do they belong to, and which classes, which prefix to use. I'm not super familiar with these languages, but there are definitely ones for like extended object, which covers at least rivers. I'm not sure if it always makes the distinction of like a stick-like object versus a cord-like object. But there's usually also round lump type things, and also other categories that pop up in a lot of languages like animal and so forth. But depending on languages like Zulu and Xhosa and Swahili, and there are other massive number of languages in that family called the Bantu family.
The Bantu family.
Yeah, the Bantu family. You can see fairly similar categories again there. So this pops up, in 3 different parts of the world.
There's another thing you said that
At
pops
least.
up strangely in 2 parts of the world. Something that was true in, I think, Somali and one of the Native American languages. I forget.
Oh, yeah. That will probably. Well, there's a couple things that Somali does that a lot of the languages I work with here in North America also do. But before I get into that, I guess the key thing is, though, it does kind of look like these shape, what we usually call shape classifiers. If it's in verbs, we call them verbal shape classifiers. If it's in used to count nouns, they're usually called just classifiers, or in, I guess we call them the shaped type, the kind of classifiers. I would point out I'm not a specialist in the research of any of these things. I've just sort of bounced around the world of languages long enough to get a sort of superficial sense of these kinds of things. But needless to say, there are linguists who really works very specifically on, say, the classifiers used in Mandarin and most of the other languages in East and especially Southeast Asia. In that whole region, those are big. And then there are people who specialize in verbal shape classifiers in various North American language families. Although, for North American language families, there still haven't been, I think, a ton of comparative work between the families. The challenge of working with North American languages is that they have been so aggressively marginalized due to colonization that people who are working with them, both indigenous people themselves and outsider researchers as well, it's usually just takes so much time and resources to get a chance to work with fluent speakers and work through all the details of the language. There's just not a whole lot of infrastructure that's not already there for you.
Yeah, the infrastructure and community is so essential there. And Ireland, your people have done so well in keeping alive their language.
Well,
I would say the Basque have done well.
It helps when you get most of your country back.
Yeah. My people, the Scottish, have not really kept Gaelic alive as much as the Irish.
Well, I'm never really clear on where the statistics are, because what constitutes keeping the language alive in a community is a really complicated thing, and what constitutes even sort of evaluating how well that's going is also really, really complex. And it's evaluating it is complex, but also just the phenomena that make it happen. What results in a community continuing to speak it regularly versus a community that has tons of speakers but no children who speak it, right? Because you might just have a larger community that used to speak it, and therefore literally by numbers more people who speak it, but no kids. You could have, further down the road, a much smaller community with literally smaller numbers of people who speak it, but all the kids do speak it, right? So which of those counts as like better by these standards is a challenging thing. I think one of the things that's the less obvious feature about language loss and language shift in communities is that it's usually not about how many people speak it. That certainly always helps, but mostly about like, do children speak it, and especially do children speak it to each other? Because you can imagine that there are places in the world where there are languages that probably have never had more than a couple hundred or several hundred speakers, or even less. They're a language that might be spoken in just like one village. But as long as people just keep on speaking that language generation after generation, they continue to just only have a couple hundred speakers perfectly stably over time. Versus there are languages that can literally have millions of speakers, but can now be undergoing shift where all of those younger generations of those millions of speakers have now shifted to another language. Like where I used to live in Indonesia, even in 1994, when I was living in Bandung, the local language is Sunda. And everybody my age could definitely speak it. And a fair number, especially older generation people who had come to the town, actually had to learn it in order to be functional in that area. But by the time I was there, Indonesian as the national language had really set root. And my understanding now is that not the people of my generation who speak Sunda they usually haven't really raised their kids to speak Sunda, or it's certainly not as consistent as it used to be. And Sunda, when I was there, I don't know the exact statistics, but it's probably like 20 million speakers at least. But 20 million speakers my age and older. I don't know how many speakers there are of what would be our children's generation or younger. And
I saw a transition just like that in Kent, Maine. So Kent, Maine is right up against the French part of Canada.
Yeah.
And in that town, everybody over like 30, 32, 35, they all speak French fluently. Everybody under 16, 18, whatever, not a word.
Yeah.
In that time, the border became a real border. You couldn't just go there to pick up bread. It was like a whole thing now. You have to have your passport with you.
Actually, I wanted to just interject with a sort of midway question here. We did start by doing a fairly deep dive into some technical or at least practical aspects of linguistics with regards to some of these North American languages and elsewhere. But taking maybe one or two steps back, especially for our listeners, can you maybe explain what, especially since we're now talking about some of the social aspects of language in real life, what does a linguist do sort of on a day-to-day basis or regularly that may or may not sort of have real world impact. I'm sure our listeners that are not linguists or are interested in linguistics or previously, because I'm sure there will be after this episode, they're probably wondering, what does a linguist actually do?
Well, linguists are kind of a wildly diverse array of people. So there are linguists who only research their own language, their first language, partly because they can be a sort of unending source of data for theories and models and experiments to do that. Then there are linguists who go and work with peoples they're not remotely related to because they're interested and have the resources to do it. And there are linguists who work with like I work in language reclamation, helping communities that that usually due to colonization and other pressures have been over generations pressured to not speak their language, pressured to.
Was that what you were engaged with in Indonesia?
No, I was just an exchange in Indonesia.
Oh, okay, cool.
No, most of my work with language reclamation is with indigenous communities here. On both sides of the border here in Maine and a little bit over in New Brunswick and thereabouts. And also further south, I work with people with Montauk, Shinnecock, and Uncochauk people of Long Island and various other folks. And so, here in most of North America, and it's not rare in other parts of the world either, people speaking their own communities that have been under serious pressure, especially over the 20th century, to act, all kinds of horrible things basically have been done to them in order to encourage them not to speak their language, or to put it, it's more than just discourage them to speak language.
Yeah, give some examples. Give some examples.
It's just horrible. I mean, mostly, as you might imagine, you have a generation of people who grew up speaking the language at home. When they went to school, they were simply just punished, humiliated, shamed, often physically abused for speaking their language. Now, when those people grow up, what do they decide to do? What language do they decide to speak to their kids? Very often, those people continue to speak the language among themselves with their brothers and sisters and whatever, and cousins.
But not to their kids.
But not to their kids, because two things happen. One, you're 5 years old when you enter school, and then everybody in power and in control there is telling you that your language is terrible and it's making your life awful, when in fact it's not. It's the people in power who are doing that, right? But then you have to go through at least 12 years of that kind of day in, day out, people telling you that your language is the problem, right? When you grow up,
it's going to be ingrained.
It's really hard for people to overcome that. I mean, I've worked with people and the other side of it is, once a community has started to shift, like, if you're a fluent speaker of your language, but even if you decide to speak your language to your kids and make sure they know the language, unless everybody else does that, your kids don't have anybody their own age to talk to in their language. They don't get to relate to each other in the language. They can relate to like old folks like you, but they can't relate to each other in the language because the other kids in the community haven't been raised speaking the language. And a lot of times that's one of the big challenges that people deal with, is that now in communities where there still are a decent number of fluent speakers of the language, it's still very hard for people in the community to speak the language in public. Not so much because someone from the outside is now in a position of power to like stop them. That has thankfully changed a lot, but mostly because there's so many people from their own community who never got a chance to speak their language. So if we speak our language among ourselves and this other person only speaks English or French, right? We're excluding our own people from our conversations. And that forces us to be like, okay, I guess we have to speak English or French to include our own people. And that's, so like, once there's enough people who don't speak the heritage language, it's really hard to figure out how to keep on speaking language without excluding them, or to put it another way, how to figure out how can we bring those people into the language.
And how does a linguist, or your type of linguist, Conor, the linguist, help with that?
Talk about what you're doing with the dictionary.
Yeah.
The problem is that like what I just outlined is very much a social interaction issue. It definitely involves language. It's a social interaction about what languages are we going to speak with each other, why and how. And there's a branch of linguistics called sociolinguistics where people research that, they deal with that. In some cases, try to help people, communities, like make policy decisions about what they might want to do or not do around that. Sociolinguistics is an amazing field of linguistics, and it's kind of underfunded, I guess is one way to put it, because it first of all has the word socio in it, so it already doesn't sound very STEM-like. And linguistics is kind of a divided field because there's people who've been doing sociolinguistics since basically forever. And then there are other chunks of linguistics where people literally just want to know how syntax works, how sentences are put together in one language, any language, and so forth, and are just not particularly concerned with sociological issues of language. Or they might be concerned with it and care, but just don't have any tools to usefully help people in that realm because they're trained to like analyze syntax. There's people who are trained to analyze nothing but like the sounds of language or the signs of signed languages, and not even the syntax and so forth. So there are lots of specialized corners of linguistics. And it's been a real challenge, I think, because most of us, if we're trained in linguistics, it's rare to become a linguist at all, because it's not like you have linguistics class in high school that makes you want to become a linguist. And it's not like there's signs on it when you get to college, if they even have linguistics courses, to let you know that they exist, to let you know there even is a field of linguistics. And then once you even get into those courses, the main things you tend to get taught are some introduction to the scientific study of the sounds or signs of sign languages of language, then also how words and phrases are put together, which is basically morphology and syntax, but how you put all the bits and pieces of language together. And then also semantics, the study of meaning of language. And so when you ask, like, what does a linguist do every day? Well, typically, most linguists are a specialist in exactly one of those things.
Yeah.
And then there's linguists who are sociolinguists who have to study like the interaction between language and society, like the ones we've just talked about. And they have to know at least a decent chunk of all of those parts of the field, because they're going to have to deal with like, how does the meanings of language interact with social stuff? They have to be able to identify, like, when we notice people who belong to that group seem to talk this one particular way, they use this particular grammar, we'll have to draw from our knowledge of morphology and syntax. And of course, the accent of that group, we'll have to draw from our knowledge of phonetics and phonology of the sounds of language to identify that. So sociolinguists usually have to kind of know a fair bit about all of the stuff. And then other linguists are going to do deep dive research into one of those particular corners of the field. There's also historical linguistics, which, as you can imagine, is sort of tracking the histories of languages and the communities that this type of communities that speak them. So what does a linguist do every day? Well, first of all, they try to figure out what kind of linguist they are. And then, and me, I was actually sort of in grad school, I guess sort of I work in morphosyntax in terms of like the sort of deep dive, narrow theory part of the language. So I work mostly with like how words are built, how phrases are built, those patterns within various languages, and then comparing that across languages. And then I just came in working with indigenous communities. You just cannot responsibly say, all I do is work on morphosyntax, word building, right? When you're in a position to help communities who are trying to reclaim their language or keep on or maintain their language and so forth. So usually I still do that kind of like rarefied theoretical work, but even there, mostly to help people who didn't get a chance to learn the language from earlier generations, to help make it easier for them to understand the patterns of their language that they're trying to reclaim, trying to speak again. And also even for fluent speakers who often have a hard time teaching their language or sharing their language, because they just speak it like anybody. You just speak your language. You don't know how it works. You just speak it. And so oftentimes they're trying to teach their grandchildren and so forth. But the patterns by which the language works are not obvious while you're talking. And so your grandkids or the people who are learning from you are asking, well, why do you say it this way? And why do you say it that way? And it's a bit like asking somebody, any English speaker, sort of asking them, okay, so you just said, have you eaten today? And then before you said, did you eat today? Have you eaten today? Did you eat today? What's the difference? And your average English speaker is not going to be able to explain, oh, I can tell you exactly why I said, have you eaten today in that context, as opposed to why I said, did you eat today in this context. Now, there are linguists who literally research the difference in the difference in meaning between those two things. But your average fluent speaker only kind of unconsciously knows
Right.
the difference and unconsciously knows which way. So
Right.
as linguists, we can be helpful in someone to a kid, a younger generation person who's trying to learn a language with like something like that going on, to hopefully we have done the research and asked the right questions to help figure out like what is the difference in meaning that's going on there, and which then drives why someone says, have you eaten today in this one situation, but did you eat today in this other situation? So we try to like solve those kinds of, do our best to help answer those kinds of questions as they, those kinds of questions as they come up if and within and for the heritage languages of these communities. So most of my work is actually doing, it's funny, it's this mix of kind of working in theoretical fancy stuff, but always to try to solve the practical problem of like, what does this mean? What does this pattern, when you change the word this way, what meaning does it add or change? Specifically so that people who are trying to learn their language again can also understand that meaning.
So very concretely, you are working on a dictionary.
Yeah, I mean, that's, no, I mean, that's the least concrete work I do.
Well, talk about it. I think it's interesting.
I have a long, I have a very overdue set of edits due for the Penobscot dictionary. And we're looking to try to finish that out by the end of this year and get it into proper publication process over the start of the next year. But the other thing project that I've been involved in is a book we already have out, which is called Still They Remember Me. And it's a collection of 13 stories told originally in the Penobscot language.
Wow.
Translated at the moment by a Penobscot storyteller by the name of Newell Lyon. And to an anthropological linguist named Frank Speck in about the 19 teens. So these stories and more were actually published in an academic article in 1918. And the Penobscot people have since been using like photocopies of that article as part of their language program and stuff, but it's very hard to use. The transcription that's used, everything's just sort of very densely smushed on the page. People use it and they get quite a bit out of it, but it's still just really hard to work with. So Carol Dana, who is literally the Penobscot language master in the Penobscot community, and Margot Lukens, who is a professor over at Orono, University of Orono, they'd worked together on a theatrical adaptation of some of these stories. And then Carol said at some point during the process, we need to republish them. And they invited me in to come and join them, where I had also already been working for a number of years now on language reclamation efforts. I've worked with Carol, I've known Carol over 20 years now. My particular thing that I was helping with was first helping retranscribe the stories in the spelling system of the language that the Penobscots currently use, that Carol uses and her colleagues use to teach the language. Luckily, I'd actually already done that in grad school for my spare time, sort of. But the main thing was actually doing a much more learner-friendly layout, where each line of the story is, you have one line in Penobscot right here, and then on the facing page, you have the equivalent English translation there. And then beneath each line, you have every word in the Penobscot sentence, Penobscot line, just word by word by word by word. And then over on the opposite page, the corresponding English. And for that, that's obviously to help learners really go word by word, not and line by line, to really know what each of the words mean. And in particular, when we did the translations, we tried to make if there was a question of like, would this English be smoother if we made it less likely what's actually being said in the Penobscot? We just didn't do that. We let the English be kind of a little bit rough and sort of unusual sounding, as long as it, if that meant that it would really convey what we were understanding was said in the Penobscot. So we basically made the English have to follow the Penobscot as close as possible.
I felt
so
that. So I
Yeah.
have the book and I read part of it,
Mhm.
and it does have a very poetic, but it definitely sounds like the word order sometimes with the word choice is not purely, culturally American. It's
Yeah,
Native
yeah.
American.
And that was intentional because we want to help the kids in the Penobscot.
What's the book called again? Just for listeners.
Still they remember me. Still they remember.
Will they remember me?
Yeah,
We'll probably put the Amazon whatever
Yeah.
link in the.
We'll put it in the show notes. Here it is.
Yep.
Yeah, it's pretty easy to find under that name. So yeah, we kept the English translation as sort of hewed closely to the Penobscot as possible, even if that made the English a little harder to read, because the whole goal was the point of the English is to help the kids and their parents who are reclaiming the language together, understand the Penobscot language itself as best we could even help them understand it. And it's not like, and we ourselves have our limits, to say the least, in how much we understand. But that was the whole goal, was accessibility above all. So like in the book, we have a reader's guide to language patterns. It's not like an entire textbook for learning Penobscot, but it gives you an intro kind of foot in the door to some core language patterns. And if you ever see it, you'll notice there's not a single piece of grammatical terminology used, because as I found in this kind of language work, you just don't need it, right? To explain the patterns of a language, all you have to do is really focus on what does this pattern mean? Like when you change the word this way, how does it change the meaning? And then maybe point out like what are the sounds or signs you have to change in order to make that change happen, right? But you don't have to call it whatever we linguists call it grammatically as a grammatical term. Like there's tons of jargon around these languages: obviative, transitive, inanimate, obviative, conjunct, right? Is something you can actually say in linguistese about these languages. But but none of that is actually necessary to explain exactly all the meanings that are conveyed by that jargon, by not that jargon so much as what the form in the language we're actually talking about. I mean, basically, what did I just say? Well, that one might take a little while to explain out in English, but it would basically be something like, I think I said something like, this won't be exactly, but I think I said transitive inanimate conjunct. And that would just mean, essentially probably a pattern like when she sees it, when she something's it is all that means. So the linguist jargon is not necessary. We could just sort of say, here's the pattern for when you say, when this happens, and then here's the pattern for saying she does it to it, right? And so you can explain basically, and there are patterns in the language, like we talked about the shape patterns. We can explain those in perfectly plain terms as well. And so it's when you sort of get, there's a funny thing about linguists is that we tend to really love, coming up with jargon. We love words. So we like to make words for our own shop talk. And so we have things like transitive and obviative and conjunct and wonderful jargon for phonetics and so forth. But it's really off-putting for learners because it makes people have to learn this like other language, linguistese, linguistic terminology, just to get to their own language. And so a lot of the work that I've been doing is just sort of realizing we can cut out that really off-putting and highly unnecessary middleman and just go straight to like, what do the patterns mean? And how, and then, how do you say those patterns? And then you can get on with saying those patterns so you can say what you mean. And if you're reading these stories, understand what people are meaning. So, and then we have kind of a similar kind of like no frills guide to the sounds of the language and so forth. So most of my work in recent years has been this kind of funny, there's a thing in academia, I think overall, and it certainly is a thing in linguistics, where people tend to think that there's some kind of opposition between doing like kind of high-end theoretical analysis of morphology and syntax and then like doing language materials for beginning learners. People often think they're just like not the same thing, or you don't need to know a whole lot of like fancy theory in order to come up with beginning intro lessons in language. My experience has been those two things are actually the same, right? That unless you look at the language really, really in depth and try to understand the whole system in fine detail and as a big holistic system, you can't really design beginner lessons that are really going to help beginners, because you can just come up with like random beginner lessons. Here's how to make plurals. Here's how to do the past tense. Here's how to do this. But then learners are just like having to memorize this and then having to memorize this and then having to memorize this. They're just juggling all these things that don't seem to have any connection to each other. Versus if you're looking as a linguist, you analyze the whole language and try to understand it as kind of an ecosystem of, well, this is a little pattern, but it connects to this little pattern, connects to this little pattern.
Right.
You can see how everything relates to each other. Then that gives you a good idea of what's the first simple thing you might want to show a beginner. What's the next thing that we know will build off of that? What's the next thing? And again, that ecosystem of little pieces of language, it's not just about like, grammatical phenomena. It's also the ecosystem of what are those things used for to communicate on a daily basis, So the design we always go with really is about understanding how the whole system, trying our best understanding how the whole system works, how each of the parts relates to all the other parts as best we can. But then from that selecting like which would be a good starting point and the next following things that build off of that. But also always doing a Venn diagram of that, the intersection of that, what's optimal just from that perspective, with what do people actually say in the language on a day-to-day basis, and what does a beginner need to be able to say in the language to feel like every time they go to learn the language, they're actually moving forward and being able to communicate more and understand more. So we have this, it's not just about like abstract linguistic structures and how it all works from an academic standpoint. It's thinking about that as a way to inform an optimal way to present practical everyday language. So you always, as a beginner, you're always learning practical everyday language, but we're giving it to you in exactly the order that allows you to kind of somewhat consciously or unconsciously pick up the fundamental patterns of the language that you're going to be able to use everywhere. So it's about things that people usually put in opposition, like ordinary communicative language and grammar. We just literally are like, they're not in opposition. If you look at them from the right perspective, you can merge them and present them equally at the same time. And interestingly, without any technical jargon or anything like that. So
Balak speaks Farsi and Swedish, right?
Oh.
And English and Spanish and French.
All right. So
you definitely speak more languages than me.
I speak 5 languages, out of which only 4 are decent. My Spanish is rudimentary.
Mine are all kind of rudimentary. I mean, reasonably okay in Mandarin, Chinese, and Indonesian because I lived in those places.
Nice.
And then,
I mean, for me, the first 3 kind of came for free. I was born in Iran, so I'm Persian or Farsi native. And then I grew up in Sweden since the age of 6, so that was for free as well, so to speak. And then, of course, English for everyone just comes. I think back when I was a kid in Sweden, and the kid as in, middle school and secondary school, English was taught from, and this is, early 90s, from I want to say 6th grade or 7th grade. So yeah, those first 3 came pretty quickly, and then French in high school, and the Spanish later on my own.
Yeah, it's in the work that I do, I think one of the biggest challenges is that, people don't have a whole lot of opportunity to pick up their languages for free anymore.
Right.
Language.
Well, I mean, the opportunity was there. Sorry to interrupt you, but there was, and I don't want to equate it with, Native Americans or natives, indigenous people elsewhere being treated in a hostile way when it comes to their own culture and language. But there were, let's say, similarities in the sense that when you grew up, and I'm sure a lot of immigrants in many different places of the world can relate to this, that there were implicit and explicit ways in which you were led to believe, or more importantly, your parents were led to believe that you were not going to be a well-adapted, well-integrated, well-assimilated member of society if they kept holding on to, their own culture and specifically language. Language was sort of at the center of the integration assimilation debate in Sweden, still is in many places, not just Sweden. So many immigrant parents chose to speak with broken Swedish, because of course their Swedish were never and continued never being as good as their children's and their second and obviously their children's generations Swedish, trying to just do what they thought or society led them to believe was the right way of securing a good future for their kids in this new country, in this new society.
Yeah.
My mom was an exception there, thankfully, where she insisted on, and then it's, I don't know, I'm guessing it had to do with her own background as a teacher, that she thought, no, you're going to learn Swedish fluently, no matter what, but at home we're going to speak Farsi. So that's what me and my sisters always did, and that's why to this day my sister's Farsi is far better than our peers, meaning friends and other people in that community, Iranian Swedes in Sweden, just because we were pushed to. But that was the exception. The general rule was that, and it's not just Iranians, Chileans and Syrians and Iraqis and many other large minorities in Sweden were actually pushed, again, explicitly and implicitly, to deny their heritage, because now you are in this society and you need to be homogeneous with that.
Yeah, that, I'm so sorry. I mean, that ideology is everywhere, and I think part of the problem is where that ideology exists. It's like a truism. People are just sort of like, well, this makes sense. This is the only way things could be, but it's an ideology. It's a sort of culturally specific notion that's just pervasive in certain kinds of cultures.
Right.
But you go to other places in the world, and people are like, well, you come from somewhere that has its own language. Of course, you speak your own language. If you're going to be here, we would like you to also speak our language. But there's no particular reason why you have to abandon your own. And I think that's it's a very culture specific notion, whether or not people think. Almost everybody agrees if you move to a place, you should probably make sure you speak the language that is most commonly spoken there.
Right.
Almost nobody argues with that. Right.
Correct.
But the big question is what drives the ideology of, oh, but your kids should just not speak your language anymore.
Right. Well, I mean, I'll tell you what was like a common fear, and this is a sort of fear mongering that's and non-scientific or maybe even anti-scientific, or was at the time. I don't know how it is these days in different parts of the world with large immigrant population. But back then it was this belief that no, if you try to force your kids to be bilingual, retaining their mother tongue while learning the language of that country, they're going to be confused and they're going to develop slower, and they're not going to be that good at either of them. So let them focus on what matters, and that's the new language in the new country. When in fact, from what I've gathered, and again, this is also, you're the linguist, but it seems to be the opposite. I mean, anecdotally, I can just speak for me and my sisters that our Swedish ended up being eventually, not to begin with, but eventually far better than our average peers, meaning average Swedish ethnic Swedes. And
Really?
then to add to that, I know for sure now that I speak, but of course I got a PhD as well and stuff. But regardless of the higher education, I knew pretty early on, say by late high school, senior in high school, that I spoke better Swedish than the average Swedish person, just because I read more and I had more interest in languages in general. By the time I was starting to learn English, I would say I learned even English faster than my peers. And again, this is not scientific, so I don't know what the academic research says on this area, but the fear, at least, and the arguments against it were sort of on the other side of it, saying that no, they're going to be slower at all of it, and you're just going to confuse them, let them focus on one.
Yeah, I think there's this sort of scarcity mentality. And there's also, I think, a failure to recognize something that isn't super obvious, which is that there's basically no such thing as languages, right? What there are kind of like linguistic repertoires. You have like, whatever, when you, whatever number of, if we count them as separate things, whatever number of languages you speak, just really reflects your experience in life, and like your experience in life, your linguistic experience in life overall. So if you grew up, suppose you had been born into your family and grew up speaking Farsi only in Sweden, there's probably a bunch of Farsi you wouldn't know because you only pick it up in Iran.
For sure.
But if you were born in Iran and were around there long enough, you'd pick up a bunch of that. And then maybe there's like cool teenager Farsi that you don't know because you weren't a cool teenager in Iran.
Certainly.
Right?
Spot on.
But one of the things is nobody ever knows their entire language. Even if they only speak one language, you don't, I speak English, but I don't know all of the terminology that plumbers use. I don't know all of the terminology that, because I've never really done much plumbing, right? I don't know. There's all kinds of terms and expressions.
Right. So it's not just generational.
But no one's worried about, oh my God, he didn't learn all the plumbing terms. His English is terrible, right? I mean, I didn't speak any languages other than English until I was about 12. So I'm definitely like the safest case of one of, from that kind of ideology. But, people generally learn the language they need to learn and the language they want to learn based on their interests. So like, like you said, you ended up learning a lot of like high level, high register Swedish because you liked language and you liked reading and you liked school and so forth. Lo and behold, you go off to be a PhD. And that has, as you can see, almost nothing to do with how many languages your parents did or didn't speak to you. It just has to do with like your interests. So your language learning went where you took it. And what one tends to find is that like, in the same way, if I only speak one language, I'll use certain versions of it for certain situations because that's the language I used in that situation. How I talk to my grandmother, how I talk to my friends. Well, if you grow up bilingually or more, you just have sort of more of that, right? There's a certain version of language. There's a certain version of language I use with my parents, which is called Farsi, right? And there's a certain language I use in school, which is called Swedish, right? And so on. Then to the outside world, it's English and so forth. But
I love that statement. The whole, there's no one language.
Languages don't exist.
These languages don't exist because. Sorry, go ahead.
And you see that too, because I imagine one of the evidence of that is that, if you think about just within English, like the versions of English that I control as someone who for the first 12 years, I didn't speak anything but English, right? I still, even at that age, had like 3 or 4 different versions of English, depending on who I was talking to, situations, family members, who you talk to and how, and so forth. And if you look at those different versions of English, they're very close to each other, but they have slightly different vocabulary, like different vocabulary I use only with my friends, my own generation, maybe even slightly different pronunciation. We've shifted, among my friends, we shifted pronunciation, but if I use that pronunciation, my grandparents won't understand me, kind of thing. And
that was true in Boston.
Yeah, and definitely slightly different grammars and so forth. Now, when somebody is multilingual, they just have slightly more extreme versions of that. Or significantly more extreme versions of that, where like the way I talk to my parents has very different pronunciation and very different vocabulary and very different grammar. But it's just, it's just a more extreme version of what you would be doing within, quote, one language anyway.
For sure.
And it all takes the same amount of lifetime to learn anyway.
That's a very good point.
Yeah. It's just, all it does is your language reflects the life you live. And it's not really.
I love that. Language reflects the life you live.
And so that's, I think, one of the big questions is when people have this kind of scarcity mentality, that it ultimately reflects not it reflects a little bit of a misunderstanding about how language is, but also reflects this kind of very fraught relationship of like, what kind of life, what kind of sociolinguistic life do we want our kid to have? Do we want our kid to be tied to their Farsi speaking heritage, to the Farsi speaking community? Or do we want our kid to have no ties to that? Are we afraid to have our kid have ties to that? Like, versus
Right,
do you think it
right.
would be like a benefit to the kid in their life or a drawback?
Right, there's also some
have those ties.
nuances like that. I
Yeah.
mean, I'll say this, like I often get the question from people who discover that, oh, you're multilingual. Which language do you think in? And you know, the cliche answer is, well, it depends on context and stuff. But the more accurate and probably a little bit in-depth answer is none. It's not that I walk around and think that, okay, now I'm communicating to Graham and I'm gonna think in English when I'm thinking about talking to him, or even contextual. It doesn't have to be who I'm talking to or who I'm thinking about. People think that, okay, well, is it such that in matters of family or matters of the heart you think in Farsi, and that in matters of memory you think in Swedish because most of your memories are in Sweden, and then other scientific matters you think in English? It may be so, but I have to really think about it. Like I have to go back and index my thoughts if I remember them, or in the moment start having this meta consciousness about my thoughts to be able to label them, to be able to answer that question. Because the truth is that I don't know. The truth is that as I'm going about it and doing it, it's all just one language. There's no separate languages. I'm just having my thoughts, and then yes, sure, I can go back and try to label them in a specific context. Then maybe it's driven by context in some cases. In other cases, it might just be purely random. I just happen to know, or it's not even knowing. It's most words, especially between the four languages that I speak well, I know most words in all of those languages, and it's not like I know them better. I know a certain word better in Farsi than in French. It's just that I know it. I know the word for microphone in both languages, or the word for that's technical, but the word for hugging in all languages. It's just that I have my thought processes and processes and my conclusions. And then it's only afterwards when I get prompted, what language did you think in, that I can go back and guess what? Often it's a mix. It's like, oh, well, when I was in the past 10 minutes, when I was thinking about this, there were these concepts that probably in my mind were in French or in Farsi, and these ones were in Swedish, and these ones were in English. So and you will see that reflected when I speak with my sisters who speak at least 3 of those languages commonly with me. We will talk to each other in a way that only someone who speaks all 3 languages will understand, because we will say a sentence, a short sentence of like, say, 10 words, where you will have words of every single language of those 3 in that sentence.
It's not very common. Ladies.
I was exactly going to ask you about that, because I figured that I was almost certain that was going to be your situation. I was literally going to ask you about your siblings, and like, you guys probably speak in something that can't be called any one of those languages, but is
correct. It cannot.
I've even my sister started to learn Mandarin at age 40 and lives in Taiwan now, and so speaks Mandarin. So sometimes when I learned Mandarin kind of separately, but sometimes when we're talking, particularly around like subjects in the Chinese speaking world, we will slide in and out of all of that. And I certainly remember when I was living in China,
mid-sentence.
And we all had to live in the foreign students dorm. Even when we spoke English to each other, I don't think you could understand it if you only spoke English, because we would our lives were in Chinese.
Or you even only spoke Mandarin, right? You wouldn't
Exactly, because our lives there were 90% in Chinese, and then occasionally we'd be speaking English to each other. But like every other word would just be Mandarin words for like what we did that day, because we did that in Mandarin that day. So I think I'm not super good on the terminology, but I think one of the concepts in sociolinguistics that people talk about now is the concept of translanguaging.
Oh, wow.
Where like they used to call things like code switching, like you're just switching from language to language, as if languages were real things, as opposed to translanguaging, which is more like you have a bunch of linguistic resources in your head. Some of them are called Farsi, some of them are called Swedish, some of them are called English, but you can call upon any and all of them pretty much however you see fit. So if you're talking to somebody who only speaks Farsi, you're probably going to kind of, not use a whole lot of Swedish, right? But if you're talking to somebody who speaks only Swedish, you're going to use not a whole lot of Farsi. But if you're talking to your sister, you get to use whatever works, right?
Yeah.
And usually whatever works is this mixture of these various.
And you know what it is? It's the path of least resistance. It's like whatever is the most efficient. And efficient can be in time, but it can also be in conveying meaning as well.
Yeah, nuance.
Whatever is most efficient, and it comes very natural and very rapidly. Like it's not like I have to think about, because then it's not efficient. It's just whatever flows, and it's most fastest, but also optimal in terms of conveying what I'm meaning to say.
Particularly because the particular vocabulary and words you use, like the interesting thing as well is that, while there may be no such thing as languages, every word and even every grammatical pattern has its own kind of history. So, the word for cat in Swedish and the word for cat in Farsi and the word for cat in English have slightly different nuances, slightly different histories. In your family, you might have just always
that's a very good point.
Farsi, and never talked about the cat in Swedish. So when you're talking to your sisters, you're probably going to say gorbe or pishi.
Yeah,
right?
nice.
You're not going to use the Swedish word because like we always talked about our cat in Farsi, right? Or
Right.
we always talked about cat in Swedish, so you're always going to use
that's an excellent example, because that might exactly as you're implying, that might even differ between different families that have similar backgrounds. Like we had these family friends who we grew up with, a brother and sister who are also Iranian Swedish, and we grew up next to each other for many years. And what's fascinating was that we were both around the same ages. Me and my sisters were really into Simpsons. That brother and sister were really into the Simpsons. But the way we in our families consumed Simpsons amongst siblings was slightly different. So when we talk about the Simpsons in this particular episodes, and we sometimes do it still, like in WhatsApp chat groups and whatnot, that mixture of Farsi, Swedish, and English, because obviously Simpsons was originally in English and showed in English and on Swedish television. That mixture is very different. We choose, like me and my sisters choose to select, and it's starting to dawn on me now, but based on what you said, it's really because of our slightly different family culture that we had in our family, that we choose to say certain words when we talk about the Simpsons in Farsi and English and Swedish, while this brother and sister choose to say other words in that mixture, but also still mixing Swedish, Farsi, and English. But it's different ways of speaking, but using the same linguistic resources.
Yeah. I mean, I think I think that sort of ideological, the desire, the ideology of like telling people, don't speak your language to the kids, it'll confuse them and then they won't be good at the dominant language of the local area, blah 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 blah. I mean, there are sort of nastier reasons for that kind of ideology, but I think there are a lot of the reason why that ideology persists is just people have this fear, this sense of scarcity, of like that there's like a linguistic scarcity going, right? That you can, a linguistic zero-sum game where you can only be really good or competitively good or as good as you need to be in the world to get by in the world in just one language. And that's just really not true, because, especially if you're exposed to, any number of languages as a kid, you tend to pick up the fundamental pronunciation system and the fundamental, like how you organize words and stuff, system very early on and very easily. And then from then on there, the only limiting factor is like your vocabulary, and your vocabulary is basically going to be whatever your life is, right? However much you engage with people in Swedish or engage with people in Farsi or read in Swedish and read in Farsi or whatever, however much or however little you do that, that's what determines it. But being able to fundamentally just speak the language at all at a sort of, basic everyday level, I don't think really limits you. It doesn't take that long. So learning to do multiple
Conor
doesn't, especially as a kid, doesn't really limit you very much. And then from there, like you might end up being like better at one language because you went and got a PhD in it. So you're better at like writing PhD level papers in that language. and maybe
Right.
not so much in the other. But like the world is such that you usually don't have to like you don't have to sacrifice being able to talk to your parents in Farsi just to be able to write a PhD in
That's
English and
right.
Swedish, right? You can
Connor, I
just do
remember you
both.
telling me,
Mhm.
once that it wasn't until you learned a lot of languages that you started to see that there really was a similarity between them all.
Yeah, I mean, they're
How would you
really just
describe that?
yeah. My experience, sort of being such a dilettante and dallying with this language and that, is that the only really big difference between languages is what their vocabulary is. If you look across multiple languages of spoken languages, there's a pretty limited set of sounds humans use. If you haven't learned these particular new sounds, they might seem overwhelming, but there's really not that many of them in regular use. Like if you're an English speaker learning Farsi, it's usually sort of challenging to learn the qa sound, um, like chiqad, that kind of word, qad. But that's like one additional sound beyond what English already does, right? And and learning the rhythm and the melody, the vowels, and so forth. To get multiple languages worth of that kind of thing is actually not that time consuming, certainly for a child. And I think we just have very bad ways of introducing people to that for adults. But if you do it right, it's not that hard for adults either. Um, and so then the only really limiting factor, and this is also true for grammar, right? That the order people get kind of wound up. Oh, in this language, the word order goes this way. In this language, the word order goes that way. And at first, if you're not used to like the opposite order of what you already speak, it can seem like, oh my God, how could I ever learn this? But any of us who've ever learned a second language have found that like it just takes a little while to kind of like practice saying it in the new order, say it in the new order, and then the whole
Right.
language works that way. So it's not that hard. Um, and there just aren't that many mathematically that many possible orders of elements possibilities in those languages. So that means pronunciation and grammar as word order, not really that hard. Grammar as certain kinds of meanings, those can be a little bit challenging. But one of the things we study, especially in syntax, is that there's actually a shockingly small number of like grammatical functional meanings, like things like verb tenses and plurals and masculine and feminine and things that you come to. There's actually not that many of them out there in the worlds of languages.
How many are there?
I guess it also depends on how you count them. The main thing is that they often combine together as like three of these things at once. If you count that as one separate thing, then you have bajillions of them. But if you sort of separate it out into kind of the essentials, um, most languages have some way of saying you, some way of saying me, some way of referring to the other person. And if it's a language like English, it'll split that other person into either a he or a she, or if it's Farsi, it's just un, on, right,
Mm,
and so
yeah.
forth. So there's ways of sort of complicating the fundamental of you, me, and that other person. And then of course you can, go into us here, us, and then y'all, and then them, and so forth. Um, but something along those lines with maybe an added bell or added whistle there is basically what every language has. Some languages, when you get into the yous, you can have more complex things of like shoma, like, a respectful form of you. But
Right.
again, people, if you don't come from that, people are like, oh my God, that's so hard. But if you just like hop into the culture of how people talk, it's like you kind of need that. In this culture, like it's just not appropriate to call everybody one thing. You got to, show respect. So you say shoma instead of to, right?
Yeah.
And so forth. It's
Absolutely
not
right.
it's not as hard as people make it out to be once you kind of embed it in like the meanings. What are people are just trying to say meanings that according to their culture or just according to how people have always spoken the language, these are the things we try to say. And then this is how the language does it. Um, so it's funny. It's kind of a long story, but like when you when you say use say Chomskyan style syntactic diagrams to diagram out any particular language. Um, there's a lot of theoretical.
Do you subscribe to the
I don't
universal
really
grammar?
subscribe to anything because, but if say you use that model, that approach, and take basically any language and try to diagram it out that way, you don't really find that without omitting things that are in there, like, well, including every element that within the language we know means this or means that. You find that things tend to organize in just like three basic ways. Like if you're talking about verbs, which are typically the most complicated thing you ever get in language, basically what you get with verbs is you start with kind of an element that kind of refers to the action or the state. That's what a verb is. And then you get another element above it, set of elements above it that usually kind of organize who's involved in it. So like if you have a verb like give, then the next set of elements around it just organize like how to express the giver and the givee and the thing given. But that's actually the maximum you can even do. Languages don't have verbs that have like 5 different things involved in them. You usually have a maximum of I give you it. And then there's lots of verbs like that. I give you it. I sell you it. I lend you it. I buy you it. I bake you it, right? But they all work the same way, right? So once you know how to say I give you it, then you're good to go for the rest of that. So you have that basic action, then you have like the people and things involved in it directly. And then you go up another layer and it's usually, well, the main thing is what I think you could non-technically call perspective, which is if we say, okay, so there's an action of giving, right? Well, is it completed? Like I gave you it, or is it ongoing? I'm giving you it, right? And that could be like I have given you it, I had given you it, I will have given you it. Just it doesn't matter past, present, or future. It's just like the completedness of giving versus I was giving you it, I had been giving you it, I will be giving you it. Wherever it is in time, it's viewed as ongoing. So it's the kind of the view on the event, either as completed, a completed act of giving, aka given, or an ongoing act of giving, like currently, wherever it is in time, we're looking at it as ongoing, and that's giving. So there's that sort of time perspective thing. Then once you've got that time perspective, one of the things you can do with it is actually plop that in the past or plop that in the future. Like
Right.
I had given it is, completed in the past. I have given it completed right now. I will have given it completed in the future. So you can move those things up. And you can throw in a couple other things like adding a sort of must or a can to that. But notice I just described, okay, verb, the things involved in it, the sort of time perspective on it, once of like completed versus not completed, then that plopped it to some particular point in time, past, present, or future, right? And then maybe some other things about can happen, must happen, that kind of thing. And then the only next thing you do is actually, okay, take all that material and decide how are we going to use that in a conversation? Are we going to make that as a statement? I will give you it, or something like that. Are we going to make it a question? I will give you it, right? Or are we going to take that whole statement and kind of recycle it through another layer of language and say something like, I'm telling you that I will give you it, that I will give you it, just like the whole thing recycled as what I'm telling you. I know that I will give you it. I'm telling you that I will give you it. I said that I will give you it, right? That word that is really important. It allows you to sort of cycle it back through. The whole statement can be embedded under an act of saying or knowing or thinking. That's basically all we ever find in the grammar of languages around the world. I mean, there's a lot I'm leaving. There's a lot I'm leaving out. A lot of things are actually sort of fragments or sub pieces of that.
That makes sense.
And little means of like nesting and layering and connecting two things to another. But there really isn't a whole lot more. And so when you look at it from that perspective, I mean, one of the things you see a lot of is like languages categorizing stuff. Like we've talked about the categories of shape, and some languages have masculine and feminine and various other categories. But that's over in the world of nouns, which are actually much simpler, typically, much simpler than verbs and so forth. So what happens is like, if I go from one language to another and learn the other verbs, I basically go and look for like, all right, how does this language's verbs do that stuff that I just described, which is about, I don't know, 5 to 7 at most major categories, if that, of thing. And then I'll also say, what do the verbs, besides that, do the verbs do anything new that are kind of unexpected, don't fit into my categories that I already have there? And typically what I find is that the verbs of a new language will do, 1 or 2 possible major other things besides the stuff I just listed, right? But mostly they'll do about 90% of what they do is something from what I just listed.
Yeah.
So as you go from language to language to language, you realize that like in their basic mechanics, languages superficially look very different from each other. But at the end of the day, and well, 2 things. At their basic mechanics, languages superficially look very different from each other. And it is true that every language is unique. None of them is exactly like the other, and there are always little small nuances of difference. But in their basic mechanics of how they do sort of 90% of ordinary everyday speech, they are definitely more the same than not. And what makes them different is they're pronounced differently. The words, the actual vocabulary words they use to do this stuff with is different. But how the words come together and organize themselves and from the broadest perspective is usually not wildly different from one language to another. There's also a strong tendency among languages that if you decide to say, put your verb at the beginning of the sentence, or put your verb at the end of the sentence, or put your verb in the middle of the sentence, like English says, I eat rice. Farsi usually says, I rice eat, right? Irish says, eat I rice. And so, but so does Hawaiian and so does Maori. They all have, Hawaiian, Maori, and Irish all have the same word order. Farsi has the same word order there, at least, as Japanese. So once you've learned how to say I rice eat for Farsi, then you can say I rice eat pretty easily for Japanese. You just learn the Japanese
Does
word.
anybody say rice I eat?
Rice I eat, OSV, yeah, it's relatively
says
rare in
Yoda.
some languages. It's relatively rare, but there are some languages. There are also some languages that have a slightly different sort of tweak on things that kind of mean you effectively do that. But actually,
I
the
mean,
Farsi way of saying,
apart from Yoda.
yeah, there are some languages that do that. But it turns out while there are 6 possibilities, the most common ones that occur in the world are ones like the Farsi order, the Farsi, Japanese, Mongolian, Turkish order of I rice eat, which is also found in a number of languages in North America as well. And then there is the English order of I eat rice, which is shared with like Chinese and lots of other languages. And then there is the Irish, Maori, and Hawaiian order, eat I rice. And if you just include those account for like easily, I think probably 90% of the world's languages. So if you're able to do 2 of those things, because you speak English and Farsi, and then if you go off and learn Irish, then you're basically already able to do the word orders of most of the languages of the world. Right? You're just going to have to learn the words in the language, but you're not going to learn new quote grammar. And on top of that, just learning the orders like that, there's a tendency of languages to organize themselves. Like if your verb goes at the end, then, or actually a better example is if your verb goes at the beginning in Irish, you'll basically almost always only use prepositions.
Oh, yeah.
If your verb goes at the end, it splits, but tons of languages where the verb goes at the end, you only have prepositions that follow, that is postposition. So instead of on the table, you say table on, table off, table of, table of. Farsi is interesting because it sits in a place in the world where to the east and south, the languages most originally all start with the verb, so they all have prepositions. And then if you go to the west of Farsi, the languages all have verbs at the end, so they all have their prepositions go at the end. They're called postpositions. But Farsi sits exactly in between, in that intermediate state. So Farsi has the verbs at the end, but mostly has prepositions. So
Right.
you say be Farsi, you don't say Farsi be, right? In Farsi.
That's a very good point. Yeah.
Right. But if you speak Turkish, which is right next to Farsi, it holds that. It's actually, you say, well, Turkched, that's not a good comparison example, but most of the equivalents of prepositions go after the word. You
Right.
say, so in Farsi you say on the table, but in Turkish you say table on.
Mm.
But Farsi still holds one little bit of that, which is if you say like if you say gorbero mibinam, right? See the cat,
Nice.
right?
Yeah.
Gorbero mibinam. The
I
preposition
see the
is
cat.
not ro. It's not ro gorbe mibinam. It's gorbero. You change the end.
That's
So that's
right.
a
That's right.
holdover of Farsi following the pattern that most of the verbs at the end type languages do. So it just turns out that like you learn the patterns for like the right number of more than one language, right? Really small number, like easily less than half a dozen languages. If you pick them right,
Certainly.
they represent about 90% of what languages ever do for word order and grammar. And then if you're used to that, then any new language is just literally a question of learning how to pronounce it, which is mostly just learning the usually small set of sounds you don't already know that language does have. And then the big one always at the end of the day is just vocabulary. It's just like
So
what-
everyone should in theory be able to become a polyglot, really.
Yeah, it's not really that hard. It's
Yeah.
just
Well, I mean,
We have
isn't
to-
that the future we're going towards? Most of my friends, sort of our generation,
Mhm.
have started to have kids now. Their kids are at the very least
Mhm.
bilingual, and some of them are already from the get-go trilingual. So
yeah. I think part of the problem is that much of the historically colonial world has had this ideology of monolingualism as
Right.
part of their domination efforts. But if you look at human history and human relations, wherever humans do not have radically imbalanced power relations, like there are different groups and they kind of meet in a space, but on more equal footing, that's where you get pretty rich multilingualism.
Yeah.
You only get monolingualism when somebody is really, really imperial, basically.
yeah, when there's power involved.
Yeah. Otherwise, people, they kind of need to learn each other's languages to function in those people's spaces.
Co-live,
People
yeah.
need to learn our language in order to function in their
Coexist.
languages.
Yeah.
And then there's lots of intermarrying, so everybody needs to know those languages just so they can talk to their cousins and stuff. And it's fine. And one of the interesting things about
Intermarrying
it,
with their cousins.
no, then from that they need to talk to their cousins because right? And it
Not a Spokane joke, Graham.
Well, I thought that was a Kentucky joke because
Oh,
my
Kentucky.
family's from Kentucky.
The interesting thing that happens is that when you get to those places in the world where people for over generations are multilingual, the languages themselves influence each other, and the languages tend to get more and more similar to each other. They borrow words from each other, they borrow pronunciation from each other, they borrow grammar from each other, they borrow whole expressions from each other. So, it as usual, it turns out the languages were never like discrete, separate objects. They're always very permeable creatures.
Right, yeah.
And I think
Gentlemen,
it's part of- yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. As much as I would love to continue, I'm already sort of 30 minutes late to my next commitment, but it's just a testament to how fascinating I find this episode and your vast expertise, Connor. So thank you so much. I do need to jump off, but I mean, you guys.
We're gonna stop the recording now.
Mhm.
Thank you everybody for listening today.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you
you, Connor.
for the opportunity.